Good afternoon, everybody. This is Bonnie Vandermeulen, Training Coordinator for Wisconsin Facets. On behalf of our entire Wisconsin Facets staff, I'd like to thank you for joining us today. Our webinar today is entitled Alternatives to Exclusionary Practices, Ensuring Free and Appropriate Public Education for Students with IEPs. Our presenter for today is Eva Shaw. Eva is a consultant on the special education team at the Wisconsin Department of Public Instruction. Her role focuses on support for students with social and emotional and neurodiverse needs. She has worked in the field of special education for over 25 years and has had the privilege to serve children, families, and schools in a variety of roles as a special education teacher, diagnostician, and program support teacher, a PBIS external coach, an NVCI instructor, and a special ed supervisor. It gives me great pleasure today to introduce to you Eva Shaw. Eva?
Thank you very much, Bonnie, for the introduction, and welcome to everybody who's joined us today. I just want to add a little something to the introduction of myself. As Bonnie shared, my role is as a special education consultant, serving students with IEPs who have social, emotional, and neurodiverse needs. And those areas of disability category are primarily students identified with autism and with emotional behavioral disabilities. As we get started today, I just wanted to share with you DPI's vision that every student in Wisconsin graduates from high school ready for college and career. And to achieve that mission, to achieve that vision, the department's mission is educational equity, ensuring every student in Wisconsin has what they need to be successful when they need it. A couple of times today, I'm going to ask for participants to add something into chat. And I just have a screenshot here as to where you can do that. And then I'm using two screens, so I'm trying to navigate that. So hopefully I'll be able to read your chat if you were to enter anything. So bear with me when I read your responses when I ask a question as I try to figure out how to find it on the other screen. I also know that at the end of today that we will be answering any questions that you may have. If you want to submit those questions in the question and answer section that Bonnie mentioned, and we'll address those, hopefully address those at the end of this, today's webinar. And if I'm not able to address them at the end of the webinar, I'll make sure to certainly follow up at another time. As we get started, again, I want to welcome you. I want to thank Facets for having me. It's really great that you're taking the time today to participate in this webinar about alternatives to exclusionary practice. And if you can, if you're able, I'd love for you to enter into chat what role brings you to this webinar. We all wear many hats. You know, we're mothers, we're teachers, we're sisters, we're aunts, we're friends. I'm just curious what role brings you to this webinar. And again, if you're able and enter that into the chat, that would be really great. Our objectives to understanding alternatives to exclusionary practices include the three listed here. And hopefully by the end of this webinar, you'll be able to identify positive interventions, behavioral interventions, and supports. You'll understand how positive behavioral interventions and supports are incorporated into the IEP. You'll understand how a functional behavioral assessment can help identify those positive behavioral interventions and supports. There's data to support. I'm sorry.
Yes, if you can hear me, Eva, I do have people that have responded to your chat, but it came on our question box. So if you would like that information, I have it for you.
Okay, I was wondering, I wasn't seeing anything. I am curious, like what role brought people to this webinar?
Okay, I have case manager, school psychologist, dean of students at a middle school, a mom, a special ed coordinator, a supervisor of special ed, and an educational specialist for those that responded.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Bonnie, for letting me know that. That's really helpful. And I'm not sure why I can't see that, but thanks again. Okay, so back to our PowerPoint. So there's data to support the need for alternatives to exclusionary practices. And we need to consider the following as evidence for schools to develop more equitable, culturally competent, and effective practices in supporting students whose behavior interferes with their learning or their learning of others. If we look at this graph, during the 2018-2019 school year, students with IEPs were removed for approximately 53,000 school days due to an out-of-school suspension. And as you can see here on this slide, students identified with emotional behavioral disability were removed for approximately 20,000 school days, and students identified with other health impairment for approximately 17,000 school days. Students as young as 3 are being suspended out of school. And again, during this time frame, the 2018-2019 school year, there was even one kindergarten student who was expelled with services offered. If we consider our statewide data for students who are most often removed from classroom, Wisconsin shows some disproportionality or racial bias in who gets suspended. You'll notice that our Black students are 6.7 times more likely to receive a disciplinary removal than white students, while Native Americans are 2.9 times more likely, and Hispanic students are 1 times more likely to experience a disciplinary removal. The urgency to provide positive behavioral interventions and supports and reduce exclusionary practices is highlighted by the fact that even one instance of suspension from school is predictive of future suspensions and a greater likelihood of dropping out of school, and that students impacted by trauma are suspended and expelled at higher rates than other students. So what can we do? Well, the data shows that there is a need to provide better supports for students with significant behavioral needs. Those supports should happen within the context of an equitable multi-level system of support. An equitable multi-level system of support provides equitable services, practices, and resources to every learner based upon responsiveness to effective instruction and intervention. An equitable multi-level system of support ensures that every student has access to the resources and educational rigor they need at the right moment in their education. The multi-level system of support is a system in which everything is connected, which is highlighted in this graphic. And the academic and behavioral instructional standards are the same for students with IEPs as for students without IEPs. Academically, this refers to grade level content standards. Behaviorally, this refers to social and emotional learning competencies and school-wide behavioral expectations. The subtitle of our conversation today is Ensuring a Free, Appropriate Public Education. FAPE, as it's known, for students with IEPs. To ensure FAPE, we have to understand FAPE. Most people in attendance today are educators, but for those who aren't, FAPE is, as defined by the Individuals with Disabilities Act, or IDEA, it means special education and related services that are provided at public expense under public supervision and direction, meet the standards of the department and Part B of IDEA, and are provided in conformity with the Individualized Education Program. Now, Part B of IDEA is the regulation that governs how special education and related services are provided to school-aged children with disabilities. Districts must provide FAPE to each student with a disability by developing a program based on the student's unique needs that is reasonably calculated to enable the student to make progress appropriate in the light of the student's circumstances. Documenting the program in the IEP and implementing the program articulated in the IEP. The intent is to close the gap between current and expected levels of academic, social and emotional, and functional performance for students with IEPs through individualized, ambitious, and achievable goals. Specially designed instruction integrated within universal instruction and selected and intensive intervention will look different for each student with an IEP. Student learning and progress toward mastery of grade level standards are the purposes of providing specially designed instruction to students with IEPs at all levels. As we consider alternatives to exclusionary practices, we have to know that IDEA requires IEP teams consider the use of positive behavioral interventions and supports to address behaviors that interfere with a student's learning or the learning of others. This requirement applies to all students, age 3 through 21, regardless of the student's category of disability. When addressing significant behavioral needs for students with IEPs, adults want to ensure the use of proactive and positive behavioral interventions and supports that teach mutually agreed upon expectations and result in desired learning outcomes and skills. We have to remember that positive behavior intervention supports are not label-based. They are not just for students identified with an emotional behavioral disability or autism or another health impairment. They are for any student who demonstrates the need for positive behavioral interventions and supports. And these supports are highly individualized based on student strengths, assets, barriers, and needs. Positive behavior intervention and supports have to address the student's unique disability-related needs, and like I just said, and they have to match student need, not labeled, not labels. So when we're looking at, oh, I just got to, can everybody hear me, Bunny?
Yes, I believe everybody can. There's no indication that they cannot.
Okay, I just got a flash saying that I was experiencing network connection difficulties, so hopefully not. I'll keep going until I hear otherwise. Okay, anyway, back to this slide. Disability-related needs can be academic or functional, and functional includes you know, the social, emotional, behavioral, independent living needs. And they're identified as the root cause of why a student with a disability is having difficulty accessing, engaging, or making progress. Oh, where am I? I'm sorry, I got thrown off there. The proactive and positive interventions and supports should be specifically designed to effectively address a student's unmet needs, lack of skills, or unsolved problems that are the root cause of why a student's behaviors interfere with that student's learning or the learning of others. These interventions and supports should really capitalize on students' strength and accomplishments in an effort to improve a student's access, engagement, and progress in age or grade level general education curriculum, instruction, environments, and activities. Ross Green is, he's a researcher and wrote several books, developed a model for helping support students with challenging behaviors. And he states that kids do well if they can. His model is based on the premise that challenging behavior occurs when the expectations being placed on a child exceeds the child's capacity to respond appropriately or adaptively. We need to recognize that misbehavior isn't always misbehavior. It's not always willful, manipulative, or naughty. It may be the student's brain pathways, patterns, perceptions, or habits. It's not about the child trying to misbehave, because kids do well if they can. The supports that we offer when we're developing positive behavioral interventions and supports need to be student-centered, culturally responsive, and asset-based. And adults do well if they can, just like kids do. And adults need to improve our practices, and we do better when we learn more and know better. And we have to modify our practices and the environment in order to decrease behaviors that interfere with the student's learning or the learning of others. It's the adult's responsibility to take the lead on this and not place it on the child's shoulders. For positive behavior interventions today, we're going to be talking about some evidence-based interventions or evidence-informed practices. An evidence-based practice is an instructional or intervention procedure or set of procedures for which researchers have provided an acceptable level of research that shows the practice produces positive outcomes. Now, the research may be based on certain populations or disability categories, but they may match the need of other students. So some of the evidence-based interventions that I may be sharing today, the research may be based on students with autism, but they may match the need of other students with other disability categories. Also on the slide, I'm highlighting the Wisconsin Department of Public Instruction social and emotional learning competencies. These are a great resource for learning about and promoting social and emotional learning. These learning competencies provide a guide, and I'll be mentioning them further along as well. It's really about outlining a set of skills for educators and families and students that can access and build on those skills together. Social and emotional learning is the process through which children and adults acquire and effectively apply the knowledge, attitudes, and skills necessary to understand and manage emotions, set and achieve positive goals, feel and show empathy for others, establish and maintain positive relationships, and make responsible decisions. The SEL competencies list grade bands that provide a framework for student development and understanding. And many students may not yet be performing those skills in the grade band reflective of their enrolled grade. However, the developmental chart in this competency guidance allows the educator or family to assess this child's current approximate level of functioning and help identify strategies to guide them to the next developmental level. Also included on this slide is some additional information from the U.S. Department of Education regarding positive behavior interventions and supports that can be found in the form of a Dear Colleague letter. And it's a great resource if you want to read more about positive interventions and supports. One of the virtual learning strategies that I've had to learn, and I'm sure you've all learned many as well through this pandemic, is to help with continued engagement is to make sure that we look away from the screen every 20 minutes or so. So what I'd like you to do is just take a moment to think in your head an example of a positive behavior intervention or support that you know has been effective for a child or student. I'd like you to kind of look away from the screen, maybe stand up and stretch. And then in the rule of thumb is every 20 minutes, take a 20-second break, and we're not going to take that long of a break. But if you could just take a look away, think about a positive intervention and support that you know that has been effective for a child or student that you know, and then look back and enter that into chat, that would be great. But make sure you look away from the screen for 20 seconds or so. Okay, and again, now I'm not seeing them in chat, and that may be the way that I'm accessing the information. So I don't know, Bonnie, if anybody entered anything about any positive behavior intervention strategies that they've seen effective for students?
We don't have any at this time.
Okay. Okay, well, I'm going to keep going then. As we begin to look at alternatives to exclusionary practices, remember that positive interventions and supports must address the student's unique disability-related needs. What works for one student will not necessarily work for another, and that there are some universal strategies that can be implemented as individual supports. And we are going to start with the foundation of positive behavior interventions and supports. Relationships are foundational to learning. They're foundational to alternatives to exclusionary practices and those positive behavior interventions and supports. And relationships are essential for all students. You know, all students benefit from supportive and healthy relationships with the adult at school. For students whose behavior interferes with learning, as well as with some of their relationships, it's even more important for adults to cultivate and build positive relationships. As mentioned earlier, the Wisconsin DPI social and emotional learning competencies are a great resource and provide a definition for relationship skills. And it's also important to remember that relationship skills apply to students and equally to adults. These relationship skills that we need to build on are how students interact with each other and the adults in the building, as well as how teachers and school staff interact with students. How we teach cooperation, active listening, seeking and offering help, but also how we as the adults live and model those skills with our students. The importance of relationships in an educational context is highlighted by a comment made by Dr. James Comer. He's a professor of child psychiatry at Yale University, and he stated that no significant learning occurs without a significant relationship. So it is the adult's responsibility, especially the professional educator's responsibility, to build strong and healthy relationships with each and every student. For some students, it may take more time and energy from the adult to establish an authentic and positive relationship. Adults must be intentional in cultivating these relationships through their everyday actions and words. One resource for developing these relationships is the Search Institute's Developmental Relationships Framework. The framework has identified 5 elements that are listed here, as well as 20 specific actions to make relationships powerful in a young person's life. The Search Institute also has additional information which can be found at their ideas for building developmental relationships. And when we consider that relationships are foundational, this is a great resource as we start to build those positive interventions and supports for students. Another positive behavioral intervention and support is establishing those routines and clear expectations. Those are beneficial for all students. And before we can look at individualized supports, we have to look at school or classroom-wide supports. We can't hold students accountable for something that adults have not established or made clear. Nor can we focus on and be effective to support individual student needs without first ensuring that classroom and school-wide expectations are established and clear. For our webinar today, we're talking about student-specific lowercase positive behavior interventions and supports, but some schools in Wisconsin implement the uppercase positive behavior interventions and supports, or PBIS. The link that I've included here is to the Wisconsin RTI Center, which provides professional development and technical assistance to help students operationalize the implementation of equitable multi-level systems of support, including PBIS. So they do this through a team-based problem-solving process that considers systems, data, practices, and outcomes. And it's a way to support everyone and especially students with IEPs. An additional resource that I've included here is on evidence-based classroom strategies that is provided through the U.S. Office of Special Education. We really have to look at the whole system, whether it's school or classroom-wide, before we can look at student-specific supports. So once we look at that school and classroom-wide support, we can move to student-specific. And again, establishing that clear routines and clear expectations is important for all students. As adults, we must create a supportive learning environment that sets conditions for academic and social success. And academic and social behaviors are taught, changed, and strengthened by similar instructional strategies. A critical step to support the behavioral needs of students is for adults to create a mindset that treats the behavioral needs of students in the same way as adults treat the academic needs of students. For many students, there needs to be directly taught, predictable, and contextually relevant school and classroom routines and expectations. Adults have to be consistent and provide predictability in the types of activities, in the order of activities, and in our response to students. Predictability provides students with a structure that it makes it easier to respond with behavior that supports learning. The brain relies on routines to increase the efficiency of learning. Students are better able to learn and meet the established expectation when the threat and stress in the learning environment is reduced. An evidence-based intervention is the use of visual schedules. So for a student who may experience difficulties with the skill of transitioning, they may benefit from the use of a visual schedule. It can provide the steps of a task or routine in a meaningful sequence with a clear start and finish, and can be provided to them in a very visual way. It's important to recognize, though, that any of these tools have to be taught and regularly used for them to be effective to meet that child's needs. Another positive behavior intervention and support is establishing high expectation and providing explicit instruction. Like I just said, we have to treat the behavioral needs of students in the same way as we treat the academic needs of students. And we have to proactively teach new skills, whether they are academic or social and functional skills. Explicit instruction has to focus on positive strategies that teach and reinforce new skills to replace behaviors that may interfere with learning. Students need to understand clearly why the skill is relevant and beneficial to the student, what the skill looks like or sounds like and what it doesn't, as well as the social and instructional context in which the skill is expected to occur. There's several examples of ways that we can provide explicit instruction on this slide. They're not an endorsement of any one curriculum, product, or evidence-based intervention, but just as an example to know that there are many out there. But as we use these curriculums or strategies, again, we have to remember that they must meet student need. One bullet on this slide is about providing feedback. We have to provide feedback to students when we're teaching, again, whether it's academic or behavioral. And that feedback has to be really specific, positive, and instructive versus redirection or highlighting an error. Students really need to be acknowledged clearly and consistently for displaying academic and social behaviors. And we're going to talk a little bit more on this later as well. An evidence-based intervention for explicit instruction is social skills training, which is adult-directed instruction used to address social skills. It's a collection of practices to teach children age-appropriate social skills and competencies. It can occur in both regular and special education classrooms. It can be used universally or on an individual level. So also another evidence-based intervention that I have here is the 5-point scale. And that's a great way to use to teach students social understanding. And it provides a visual representation of social behaviors, emotions, and abstract ideas. And one way that I've seen it used and highly individualized, the 5-point scale, they use characters from Minecraft in the scale as they were teaching the child about the different behaviors and emotions, and really connected to that child's interests when using that particular strategy. Let me just check my time here and make sure I'm doing okay. Okay. Another tool for explicitly teaching self-management is the emotional and physical regulation implementation tools that can be found and are provided by the DPI's Student Services Prevention and Wellness team. This is a great tool that can be used to proactively teach, explicitly teach, and support a student's social and emotional development. It's available in different forms and is appropriate for students K through 12, kindergarten through 12th grade. So this is, again, a great way to help teach students self-management, as is like that incredible 5-point scale that I referenced on the previous slide. Another proactive strategy is for adults to engage students as collaborators, to set goals, develop a plan, assess progress, and use reflection to seek continuous improvement. We really have to increase engagement as a way to provide positive behavior interventions and supports. We really need to get student voice in the planning process when matching the support with the student need. Adults need to help students identify their own common triggers, for what may cause them to, that may cause them to resort to a behavior that interferes with learning, or the triggers that help students identify potentially challenging situations in advance. So these are just some ways that we can really engage the student to get their voice and choice in this problem-solving process. We can use a menu of reinforcement options. We can survey students about what they may think works or best supports their needs. We can interview students to help them identify what works. We can use choice boards to allow them, if they're struggling with a certain task, they can choose what task they prefer to do first, second, or third. I also have referenced here the UDL guidelines. They're a great tool. It's a great tool used in the implementation of universal design for learning, which is a framework to improve and optimize teaching and learning for all people based on scientific insights into how humans learn. It really helps, these guidelines really help to plan for and provide options for engagement, and it, again, is a great resource for people. Another way to increase engagement and provide student voice is to make use of some tips and tools that the Wisconsin statewide Parent Educator Initiative provides for us. They have wonderful tips and tools on their website, and I have included that in the resources at the end of this PowerPoint presentation. These tips and tools can help develop a positive behavioral support plan with students, as well as help facilitate communication at IEP meetings. One of the tools is My Snapshot, which includes what the students feel is important to share when developing some, when they're doing some positive behavioral support planning or at that IEP team meeting. It really is student strength-based and asset-based, and it's a great way to get students input into the process. It's so important to develop a plan with, not for students. And again, this is a great way to get to this. This WISPE also provides a tool for families so that they can share what they want people to know about their child. They have the student snapshot. It's another way of getting an understanding of the whole child, not just the student. Like I asked at the beginning of the presentation, you know, what role brought you here today? We all carry with us several roles every day. And so we don't want to just look at the student. We want to look at the son, you know, the brother, the athlete, the artist. We really want to get a picture of the whole child when we're identifying the student's strengths, interests, and barriers and needs. And I think this kind of tool is even more important currently, and is a great lesson that we've learned through this pandemic, because for most of us, for many of us, students, adults alike, there's a real blurred line between home and school, between work and home due to COVID-19. And so we really need to learn from this and strengthen our partnerships between schools and families and schools. So as an example, a parent may tap into the emotional regulation tool that I shared with you from the DPI's Student Services and Prevention and Wellness team, and they may try that strategy at home and find it to be really effective and meets their child needs, and then they'll introduce it to the teacher for use at school to be included in the IEP as a positive behavioral intervention and support. We're kind of getting to another 20-minute break, and like I said, every 20 minutes it's a really good idea to spend 20 seconds to look away from the screen. And I happen to have a window, and so I try very hard every 20 minutes to look away from the screen, to look out my window, just to give me that little brain break. But because we are kind of running into time, I am going to keep going. If you have the opportunity, I would love for you to take a minute to think about how you like to be acknowledged after doing a good job or accomplishing a task. Like, how do you like to have someone say, good job? You know, all students as well as adults have different ways that they receive reinforcement or acknowledgement. Some of us prefer verbal praise or public acknowledgement, while for others, this may feel stigmatizing, embarrassing, or cause anxiety. Some of us require tangible or physical reinforcement, like activities or items, while others may require more subtle reinforcement. We have to just remember that reinforcement and acknowledgement has to be really individualized to match student need and preference. Reinforcement can be verbal, tangible, public, or earning privileges or activities. It's just very important for adults to engage with students to determine what type of reinforcement is most relevant to that particular student. It's always best to use the least amount of reinforcement necessary to support student success. Verbal acknowledgement, like I had mentioned earlier, that verbal feedback really provides information to a student about their performance or action. Feedback is an essential component of instruction and learning, whether it be academic or functional. And an evidence-based improvement strategy, an evidence-based intervention is behavior-specific praise, and I have linked it to some information about behavior-specific praise, and that lets a student know what they are doing in very clear terms. So instead of providing vague terms like good job or way to go, we would provide like the way that you solved that problem using your words and maintaining a calm body was really effective. Two very different kinds of ways to provide that feedback. And just briefly on touching on consequences. Providing negative consequences or punishments for behavior that interferes with learning does not result in the child or student knowing what to do at the moment or in the future. It's critical, like I said earlier, to teach, reteach, model, and reinforce academic and functional expectations frequently and over time. I'm not going to go into depth with consequences, but conscious discipline is used in some schools in Wisconsin, and it provides the foundation for the use of effective consequences that promote lasting change. I did include a link here about the types of consequences as defined through conscious discipline. And again, consequences, if they're punitive, are not going to teach the child anything. But if we set up logical consequences in which we kind of prearrange those consequences, or we have problem-solving consequences in which the students are involved in that problem-solving discussion to become part of the solution, those do help to change behavior and help to support student learning. Now, all of these have been alternatives to exclusionary practices, and these positive behavior interventions and supports that I've kind of gone over very, very quickly because of the amount of time we have today. We do have to know that what's not considered a positive behavior intervention and support is contacting the student about the behavior. While communication with families is critical, it's crucial, it's not a positive intervention in the fact that it doesn't teach the student something new. It doesn't provide the instruction and support needed to build, to learn and build on a new skill. Sending a student home is not considered a positive behavior intervention and support. Neither is any type of disciplinary action or removal. And just as a reminder, IDEA requires that IEP teams consider the use of positive behavior interventions and supports to address behaviors that interfere with a student's learning or learning of others for all students aged 3 to 21, regardless of the student's category of disability. Okay. Now, now that we've kind of very briefly touched on some examples of positive behavior interventions and supports, we'll move to our next objective and understanding how positive behavior interventions and supports can be incorporated into the IEP. Under IDEA, the primary vehicle for providing a free, appropriate public education is through an appropriately developed IEP that is based on the individual needs of the child. The failure to consider and provide positive behavioral interventions and supports through the IEP process could result in a student not receiving meaningful benefit or FAPE. In Wisconsin, we have the College and Career Ready IEP 5-step process, which creates a plan that identifies a student's educational needs, including behavioral and social and emotional needs, contains learning goals based on the student's needs, and describes the services a student will receive in order to progress towards learning goals. If the IEP team determines that positive behavioral interventions or supports or other strategies are needed in order for a student to receive FAPE, they must be documented in the special factors section of the IEP, and they must be included as at least one of the following: specially designed instruction aligned with IEP goals, related services, supplementary aids and services, or program modifications and supports for staff. If the IEP team determines that the student's behavior interferes with their learning or the learning of others, the student's behavioral needs must be described in the special factors section of the IEP. And this is just an example of a sample form where that documentation would occur. The positive behavioral interventions and supports must also be included in the program summary as supplementary aids and services or as specially designed instruction. If behavioral supports are included in specially designed instruction, they must be aligned to the IEP goal that addresses the needs. So as an example, for supplementary aids and services, You might want to include, for a child who has the need to use a self-management tool, you would include it in supplementary aids and services, that they would have the self-management tool, and then you would describe the circumstances clearly in the frequency and amount of when that tool is needed. For specially designed instruction, you would have explicit instruction in self-management skills and also in the use of that self-management tool. And again, you would describe the frequency amount of that explicit instruction for using those skills, learning those skills and using that tool. Excuse me. The program summary also includes the related services and or the program modifications and supports. So related services are supportive services required to assist a student with a disability to benefit from special education. So related services may be incorporating some consultation or direct service with a school social worker or school psychologist or transportation. Program modifications or supports for school personnel would be the consultation the school staff has regarding the instruction and use of that self-management instruction and tools. Now, the last objective that was part of our day's webinar was to look at functional behavioral assessment. And I'm going to go over this information rather quickly and not in depth. There is additional resources on the DPI website that can provide much more information than I can provide in the next few minutes. One way to match positive behavior interventions and supports to student need is through a functional behavioral assessment. A functional behavioral assessment is an assessment procedure that must be conducted in a manner that provides the procedural safeguards to parents and students, including obtaining informed written consent. A functional behavioral assessment is a procedure and process for identifying the root cause or function of the behavior, the variables that influence the behavior, and the components of an effective behavioral intervention plan. The functional behavioral assessment is really an attempt to remove assumptions from the adults on why a behavior output is happening. It's trying to really get down to what we see and hear, and when we see and hear it, to help us really understand the root cause of that behavior and come up with that hypothesis. The FBA gathers data related to student strengths as well as those behaviors, and places an emphasis on taking a culturally competent approach to address changes that can be made to the environment and the adult practices. Now, using the data gathered through the FBA process, the IEP team can use the likely root cause or function of the behavior to match the positive behavior intervention and supports to the root cause and student need. And maybe they'll determine that the child doesn't have a skill and we need to teach a new skill. Or maybe we have to improve proficiency in developing a skill. Or maybe it's expanding a skill across environments. As an example, in FBA that I was a part of, a student was biting and it wasn't clear as to why that student was biting. And through a functional behavioral assessment, it was determined that the child was biting as a form of greeting. It wasn't a form of aggression. It wasn't it wasn't an intent to hurt people. It was just the way the child greeted people. And so then a new skill had to be taught to replace that behavior. So instead of biting when getting exciting and seeing people that they knew, we had to teach a new skill to help that child greet people in a way that wasn't quite so painful. The functional behavioral assessment uses data so that the IEP team can then include that information and data in the present level of academic achievement and functional performance in the IEP. The FBA, that data can be used as baseline for IEP goals. It can help incorporate matched positive interventions and supports into the IEP. like I had said earlier, into either supplementary aids and services, specially designed instruction, related services, or program modifications or supports. And then if additional details are needed, and the IEP determines they want to develop a behavior intervention plan, the functional behavioral assessment, that data can then be incorporated into the behavior intervention plan, and then that behavior intervention plan is attached to the IEP. Now, like I said earlier, under IDEA, the primary vehicle for providing FAPE is through an appropriately developed IEP. But if people feel they need more, they can do a separate behavior intervention plan. But most often the components of the behavior intervention plan can be incorporated within the IEP. There is no required format for a behavior intervention plan in either federal or state law. If you do determine that you want to create a behavior intervention plan, it has to clearly describe the type of service provided, as well as the frequency, duration, and location and amount of that service. And if a BIP is developed, it must be attached to the IEP and it becomes a part of the IEP. Now, if parents have questions or disagree with decisions that the school has made, there is information and options available. Every school is required to provide parents with procedural safeguards notice. Schools also have either posted on their website or they provide it as a hard copy, the communications options for families, and I've included a link here. And families can also contact the DPI special education team, and I've included the contact information here if you have questions or concerns. Families can also make use of the Wisconsin Special Education Mediation System, which provides facilitation and mediation for free. There is also the process of IDEA state complaints or requesting due process. And this flyer is available and provides much more detail on all of these options available to families if you aren't able to resolve differences between you and the school. Another option is an independent educational evaluation, which is conducted by a qualified examiner who is not employed, is not an employee of the child's school. The parents of a child with a disability are entitled to an independent educational evaluation at no cost to them when they disagree with the local education agency, the LEA's evaluation of the child. And also the LEA has to consider the results of the IEE that meets agency criteria and in any eligibility, program planning, and placement decisions about providing FAPE to a child. There is an information bulletin about independent educational evaluations, which provides much more details than I've provided here. Some additional information that you might find helpful, and just for the sake of time, I'm not going to go over all of these as I originally had hoped, but there are several bulletins available to you and are linked on our DPI website that can be really helpful. Like as an example, Bulletin 0602 discusses the legal requirements related to disciplining children with disabilities. I'm having a hard time speaking today. And then Bulletin 0701 is currently being updated, and it provides information about addressing the behavioral needs of students with disabilities, including the use of positive behavioral interventions and supports. And then these other bulletins and resources are available to you as well, in case you'd like to dig in further and find more information about each of them. Are you able to see my screen? Well, all of a sudden I can't see my screen. I don't know what happened. Bonnie, you can see the screen?
Yes, and everybody can too as well. So I will just note the fact that those are additional resources that you have mentioned, starting with dispute resolution and all the way through the DPI social and emotional learning competencies and the physical regulation implementation tools, et cetera there.
Thank
So,
you.
yeah, sure.
Okay.
And then, yeah,
I
there
can
are
see that
others.
one now. Okay.
Okay, okay,
Now I
great.
can see. I don't know what happened there. Something happened. There was a little glitch, but okay. And then these are, again, these are just additional links. They were embedded in the slides, but I also wanted to include them here. And then one that was not included in the slides is the Supporting Neurodiverse Students. I am the grant director of this. This is a professional learning system that is brought to the state through a discretionary grant. And the professional learning system includes regional trainings, web-based events, toolkits, lots of great professional learning opportunities to support educators and families serving students with disability-related needs in the area of social and emotional learning. And I wanted to include this because that's a great resource for families and educators on supporting the behavioral needs of students. And then finally, just some other resources for evidence-based practices. A lot of the information that I gathered for this presentation today can be found at these websites, and they're just a wealth of information, an overwhelming wealth of information. But if you want to dig in further, these all have great evidence-based practices for providing positive behavioral interventions and supports for students in an effort to have alternatives to the exclusionary practices. And then finally, if anyone has any questions, please ask. If I'm not able to answer a question right here and now, I would gladly take your information and get back to you. So if you have any questions, please let me know.
I do have a question for you that someone had addressed a little while ago, and one was a question around the need versus label. If the IEP team completes an FBA and the behaviors are not found to be related to the disability, is the IEP team still obligated or responsible to intervene, or can the child's needs be met through general educational response?
Oh, that's a great question. And first, we always want to try to address the needs through universal regular education supports before we move to more intensive supports. So we always want to try to go first through the regular education avenues and problem-solving processes that a school or district may have. And then to the question about an FBA, like I had shared earlier, say as an example, a student with a specific learning disability is demonstrating behaviors that interfere with learning, and that FBA determines the root cause of those behaviors. Absolutely, the IEP team needs to address the findings of the FBA and incorporate positive behavioral interventions and supports into the IEP of that student. It is not label dependent. It does not matter that that child has an identification of a specific learning disability or a significant developmental delay or other health impairment. It is not about label, it is about student need. And so those positive behavioral interventions and supports should be incorporated into the IEP regardless of the student's disability category or label. So I'm hoping that answers your question. And if not, I do have my contact information in the PowerPoint, and please feel free to contact me, and I can certainly address that question further.
And I do have another comment before we need to close, and that is that guidance around when parents are requesting shortened days or homebound related to mental health, but the school does not feel that is part of the LRE. Can you comment on that?
Well, those decisions obviously are so individually based that it's hard to comment other than in very general terms. We do have guidance about shortened school day. One of the links in the bulletins that I shared very briefly that I couldn't go into just because of time constraints is about shortened day. If people have questions about shortened day and what things need to be considered in the process and the conversations that need to be had around shortened day, again, please feel free to reach out. we just always want to be careful to make sure that we're not taking those decisions lightly and that we're using data to base that decision. And it is a decision that is a team-based, individualized decision.
And then one quick question that we have here. I am an IEP advocate and have worked with some families who the school did not consider, and the school did not consider an FBA or looking into academics when completing an IEP evaluation, and only used observations. So the comment would probably be, where do you go next?
And again, it's hard to speak to specifics, but in general terms, if, like I shared, the independent education evaluation is an option if families disagree with the findings from the school-based evaluation team.
Okay, and unfortunately, we don't have any more time to be able to finish. And if you do have other additional questions, Eva has just put her contact information up there on the screen. And Eva, do you have any closing comments at this time?
No, not specifically. I just really appreciate everyone taking the time to participate in this webinar. And again, please feel free to reach out if you have additional questions, comments, concerns about anything that was presented. I will gladly respond and help work through that with you. So again, I thank you very much for the time and for supporting students and children in the state of Wisconsin.
Well, thank you, Eva, very much. I think that the presentation was extremely informative, and I'm sure that the people who participated felt that way as well. This concludes our webinar. We'd like to thank you all for joining us today. Please be reminded that Wisconsin Facets has over 100 trainings and webinars for the year 2021. Please check our website calendar and register for any of the upcoming trainings that may be of interest to you. And also please watch for the short evaluation that will be coming your way after today's live presentation. Thank you again, Eva, and thank you all for joining us today. Goodbye, everybody, and have a good day.